Okay, so we're on our fifth and final installment of Meet the Giants history of Halacha. So we're going to start again with tefillah for those who are still stuck in Eretz Yisrael, those who are still stuck in Gaza. Chof Aleph, chapter 121. Shila Malas as Eina Laharim Manga Ve'ezi Ezimi Matinoi Oisi Shemai Varetz. Yitain Lamet Rablacha Adam Shemracha. Yinei Layan Valishan Shem Yisrael. Adinei Shemracha Mitzilcha Yatiminacha. Yom Hashemesh Le'ekeka V'yarech L'Laila. Adinei Shemracha Mikara Yishmar Stavshecha. Adinei Shemsisa V'yacha V'ata V'yata Olam. Their merit, they should be safe. The soldiers should be successful. And this all should come to a quick, swift, and conclusive end. Okay, so we left off. As we get closer to our times, getting narrower and narrower toward essentially basically Chabad practice. As you go farther back, we're taking from all streams and all sources. But as you get closer, it gets more and more narrow to our story. So we're going to kind of narrow in that way. Although we're going to give greater context to other halachic considerations and things that are going on during this time period. And we're moving now into what we call, the modern era, right? The 16th, 17th, 18th century up until the war. So the first page there on page 1 kind of have the storyline that brings us from last week into this week. So the two major events that happen at the same time, one that has its physical impact on the Jewish people, social, material impact, and one that's a spiritual one. On the left and on the right, we spoke about them last week. On the right is on the left, is the Chmielnicki, I'm pronouncing it wrong, revolt that essentially a Ukrainian rebel who leads a rebellion against the Polish. The Jews represent the Polish because the Jews are, someone's in the office, because the Jews are tax farmers. Yeah, someone's in the office, thank you. So Jews are tax farmers on behalf of the Polish government, so this Ukrainian rebel ends up slaughtering hundreds of thousands of Jews all throughout Eastern Europe, which of course leads the Jewish people in the 1700s to be literally in a very impoverished state. The beginning of what we refer to as the shtetl starts really around here. This is the beginning of the shtetl that we think of the Eastern European shtetl is this time period. And what ends up happening is there's a big class divide between the masses of impoverished people who are therefore ignorant because they can't afford an education, and their relationship with Yiddishkeit, their relationship with Judaism, the masses of people in the simple farm towns aren't one of they don't like Yiddishkeit. They actually would love to be part of it. They're just not educated, don't have the resources to be part of it, and they're stuck in the towns, kind of left alone in these little villages all across Eastern Europe with the memory of half their family being slaughtered a couple of years earlier.
Are there any wealthy Jews?
So there are some, but they're separate from the mass. The wealthier Jews live in the cities, and they're the ones who could afford to study. And so there's a big divide between the wealthier, more educated, learned, and then the masses of populace are just ignorant and impoverished. Now, coupled with that, you have the spiritual blow that the Jewish people experience, which is in the form of Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah. I put the year 1648 just because it has a sort of poetry to it, that the year that Shabtai Tzvi declares himself as false Messiah is the same year that the revolt happens. 1648 is, sorry?
Is this the time of the Baal?
We're getting there. This is exactly where we're going. So just before the Baal Shem Tov. We're setting the scene for the Baal Shem Tov. Right? So 1648 is the year that Shabtai Tzvi declares himself the Messiah. But he doesn't actually become publicly the Messiah until 1660s. But that year it makes it interesting that in one part of the world, Shabtai Tzvi is beginning his false Messiah, and the other side of the world, in Eastern Europe, there's this revolt going on. Anyway, the nature of the false Messiah and the success of the fact that he got such a massive following of rabbinic scholarship, in huge following, and the disastrous end in that he publicly converts to Islam, of course leaves many people completely disenfranchised. But the belief in Shabtai Tzvi and this whole theology he created using Kabbalistic language about for example, the fact that he converted to Islam was explained by his sidekick, Nathan of Gaza, because the Mashiach has to go to the lowest state to elevate. So he's like elevating Islam by converting to Islam. So you have all kinds of strange theologies that get like built around Shabtai Tzvi being the Mashiach. So the fact that he's believed as the Mashiach is one element, but there's all kinds of like ideas, lots of which are borrowed Kabbalistic language that start to spread throughout the Jewish world. And even after he dies, all of these ideas still remain. Ideas like a second coming, things like that. That Shabtai Tzvi is going to come back. People are predicting days he's going to come back, and all kinds of strange things that are going on, including a certain group of Jews who actually convert to Islam with him, called the Dunme. Apparently they still exist. And some that don't convert, remain Jewish, are secretly doing all kinds of like, many of them have like ceremonious Aveda doing, where they would like ceremoniously do sin as a way of like elevating the negativity, like these weird kind of strange theology. And it persisted for a very long time, for 100 years after, right? Until, as you can see here in this bubble here, so I'm using this as an example, because this is a landmark event, which is this is a picture of the rabbi in the community Ahu. The community Ahu, Aleph Hey Vav, stands for Altona, Hamburg, and Würzburg. It's like three little villages, three little cities that today make up Hamburg. Today Hamburg is big enough to cover all three of them. But he was like the chief rabbi of this area, and he was blamed by another rabbi who lived a couple blocks away from him, named Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He was accused of being a Shabtai Tzvi believer. This Rabbi Yaakov Emden was a very learned man, very sharp man. We spoke about him once in Shabbos afternoon, we learned about him. And he would like read through all kinds of Jewish literature and find any hints and clues to Shabtai Tzvi belief and then publicly shame them. And he accused this chief rabbi, Rabbi Abishai, this very popular chief rabbi, of being a secret Sabbatian believer, a secret Shabtai Tzvi believer. This controversy lasted, as you can see there, for decades, and it ripped the entire Jewish community apart. Every rabbi everywhere had an opinion on who was right, whether Rabbi Emden was right, whether Rabbi Abishai is right, and everybody was banning everybody else. Like these rabbis would ban these rabbis for siding with the other side, and then these rabbis would ban those rabbis. So this further added to the massive demoralization of the masses. Many, in the mass populace looked at these rabbinical authority and said, "You guys, like everybody's putting everybody else in cheder. We're here stuck poor in these small little villages trying to eke out a living and serve God, and you guys are off with your scholarship and your own like ivory towers, and you guys are fighting with each other all the time anyway." It created a further divide between the mass populace and the scholarly elite. So this is the scene in which the Baal Shem Tov arrives in the 1700s. Right? So this is when you talk about the Baal Shem Tov came to revive a broken Jewish people. This is what we're talking about: a broken Jewish people that first simultaneously experienced the failure of Shabtai Tzvi and the pogroms of Chmielnicki.
Is that why they were so upset about teaching to the masses, because they should stay like?
That's right, exactly right.
And
That's right. So there's the next page there. On page two attitudes within the Jewish world had to deal with the fallout of Shabtai Tzvi and had to deal with the fact that Jewish people have been so oppressed. So what we call the Misnagdish approach, so Misnagdish means to oppose, because they opposed the Hasidim. Their approach was, they actually existed before Hasidus. Before Hasidus came on the scene, they were the Jewish establishment, and their approach was insulate, preserve. If we stick together and we teach each other Torah, and we make sure that scholarship stays around, then the masses of people can get bought into all kinds of stuff. But if we stick together, we're going to make it work. We're going to make Judaism survive. That was their thinking.
So
right? It's a similar thing to the post-Holocaust kind of thinking. Yeah.
The Misnagdish was Litvish style.
So today they call it Litvish, but it was all over Eastern Europe.
Okay, and
Litvish comes from Lithuania.
And the Sephardim.
Okay, we'll get to the Sephardim soon, but they weren't part of this controversy so much.
They were not in contact.
Not so much.
They have their own Hasidut.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. Yeah. And now I'm focused on Ashkenazi, and we're going to bring in the Sephardic soon. So I mentioned at the beginning that as we get closer, we're going to get more and more specific to my own personal experience, right? Okay, so that was the typical Jewish establishment, which later would have been called the Misnagdim because they opposed Hasidus, is to preserve Torah. True Torah life will be preserved.
they weren't worried about intermarriage and people not falling away if they don't learn anything.
They kind of felt like think of the post-war America, where you had some communities that felt, okay, we went through a massive disaster, we got to build walls around our community and survive. What happens to the masses of Jews? What can we do? We can't risk losing more. We have to stick together. Right? It's a similar thing post the Holocaust, that kind of attitude. Right? And the Hasidim, then and now, was engage. Reach out to the Jewish people, lift them up, remind them that God loves them, remind them that the neshama is pure, remind them that every mitzvah they do is important. Right? That was the Baal Shem Tov's message. And then again, post-war, the Rebbe's message. Very similar kind of parallel. Right, so those are the two responses that came between the two groups. Now, in the context of the Shabtai Tzvi failure, you can understand why the Misnagdim, those who opposed Hasidus, feared Hasidus. They thought it was another Shabtai Tzvi movement. It's populist, just like Shabtai Tzvi was, and it's Kabbalistic. Those like two, it's a recipe for the failures of Shabtai Tzvi. That's what they thought this was going to be. So they were really, really worried that Hasidus would cause a break from Judaism. They really, really were worried about that. There's new customs. We don't sing during davening. What are you guys singing during davening? Shabtai Tzvi actually was known for singing, by the way, during his prayer. He was apparently had a very good voice, and people would go to watch him sing when he prayed. So here's these guys singing during davening. They're making their own shuls with their own siddur. This is a breakaway. This is going to be a new Shabtai Tzvi failure. They were really worried about that.
Just had some sort of reasonable fear.
Certainly. They were not doing it. It certainly didn't start out as just outright hatred. Of course, over time, everything becomes political. But at least in the beginning, the ideology was well-founded. We just went through this disaster. We don't want to do it again. And this is not long ago where they had the Emdim Eibschitz controversy, where there was a real fear that rabbinic leadership is secretly Sabbatean. So maybe this is just another one. And we're really nervous about that. And so that was the break between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, kind of in response to how do you deal with the problems that we inherited. Right? To preserve, to stick together, build walls around the community so you safeguard Torah, or get out there and reach out to your fellow Jew and tell them how much God loves them and tell them that their mitzvah is important and so on. These are the two attitudes.
So the main fear of the Misnagdim is that from the Litvish will go to Hasidim.
They weren't so afraid so much of that. I don't think
Because anyway, they were not reaching out the other population.
right. So there was later a fear that maybe that they'll lose people to the Hasidim, but I don't think that was really
But
their fear.
anyway, they were not reaching out. So
Right.
they were outside. So why what's
Right, they were afraid that anybody who followed them would get into like real heresy and end up really going down a path of away from Halacha. And yet take some of the elites too, just like Shabtai Tzvi took many rabbis with him. Right, so they'll lose, you're right though, so they'll lose some of their own people that going off to this new heresy. And initially, they used to call them the Kat. The Misnagdim would refer to the Hasidim as Kat. And Kat in Yiddish is like a cult. Like that sect, that breakaway cult that's going down this terrible path. Later they gave them the name Hasidim, which means like pious ones, because the Hasidim were like doing extra halacha, as we'll see.
What the Shabbatai is Tzvi offered the
Sorry?
people? What Shabbatai is Tzvi offered the people?
Why was he so successful?
Yeah.
Till today, no one's really sure why he was so successful. But at the end of it,
Hope.
Hope and Messianism. They really thought this was it, Mashiach's going to come.
He was very charismatic. And very
Him, his sidekick, it's still today people try to figure out why he was so successful. It's a mix of the fact that Messianism was very popular then in general. It's not long ago that there was the Arizal, and he was charismatic. People needed hope. All kinds of reasons why he was successful, but he was like massively successful. There were other failed Mashiachs that were nowhere near as successful. We tried, but were not nowhere near as successful as he was. Okay, so I put the two leading thinkers from either group into this picture, but it could have put the Baal Shem Tov and other people on the other side. But you have the Alter Rebbe on the right. We celebrated his Yom Tov, what was it, on Shabbos. And on the other side, the Vilna Gaon, the genius of Vilna, representing
So up
we call them
until
Misnagdim.
now, I mean, all the Hasidim, or there weren't so many, I guess, but yet they had started, the group when it started, they were all learning together.
Yeah.
They were all coming from the same schools,
Yeah.
they were classmates.
That's right. Anyone in the first 2 or 3 generations that was a little bit of a scholar who came over to Hasidus came from now we can call it a Litvish yeshiva. Then it was just the yeshivas. There was only one. There was only one establishment of Judaism. Hasidus was like the rebellion. They were like the counterculture. They were the counterculture until they became big enough to create their own. But initially, they were the counterculture, right? So the establishment is afraid of this, right? But if you go to page 3, within a very short period of time, the fears fall away. And this is a theme we've seen before, that at the end of the day, Jews can break out into all different types of group, but if we have a shared belief in the basic structure of halacha, then everything's A-okay. So within a very short period of time, the Misnagdim, the ones who are opposing Hasidus, they see that Hasidus is not making people leave Judaism. If anything, it's bringing people to be more observant. So all the opposition kind of fell away, even if they didn't necessarily embrace the other lifestyle, but the opposition, which at sometimes got very, very fierce, basically fell away.
Right, you mentioned once before that if you see them following halacha, then you know that
Correct.
they're not a breaker.
Correct. That's basically it.
And that's what they were able to see
That's
over
right.
time.
They see that the Chassidim were actually not just they're keeping halacha, they were actually being extra careful with the law, which is why the Misnagdim actually gave the name Chassidim to Chassidim. Chassidim means a pious person. The Gemara refers to a Chassid as one who goes beyond the letter of the law. And the Misnagdim were kind of tongue-in-cheek, making fun of the Chassidim. Well, you guys are pious, thinking you're big Chassidim, because you're being extra. You're growing your beards out. You don't have to do that. You're doing extra stuff that you don't have to do.
But it's stuck.
Sorry, but it's stuck. The name stuck. Yeah.
And then what about when Al Shabbat Shulchan Aruch? Is that like considered?
Okay, so we'll get to that in a second. How the Shulchan Aruch, we'll get to that in a second. So here, the two characters I have here, and right in the top here on page 3, is responding to the Haskalah Jewish Enlightenment. The bond that brought the Misnagdim and Chassidim together in the form of an understanding of halacha came when halacha was threatened. Halacha was threatened by Jewish Enlightenment. Right? The world in general is going through emancipation, going through enlightenment. Christians are leaving Christianity, and Europe is going through its rational enlightenment stage, along with industrialization and so on. And of course, that makes its way to the Jewish world. And there's a Jewish world there's a strain of Jews who want to modernize, led by first by Moses Mendelssohn, who himself would have considered himself frum. His followers already became less orthodox, if you will, less followers of halacha, and it got so much so that the Enlightenment wanted to impose Enlightenment onto the Orthodox community, and they went to their Russian government, which still controlled officially the legality of religion in their country, and tried to convince them to change the curriculum so that there was an Enlightenment element to Judaism. And this threat, so now the Chassidim and Misnagdim may have differences about whether to sing during davening or not to sing during davening, or whether to do shechita this way or that way, they looked at each other and said, we're here Torah observant and halacha. These are the threats. So they bonded together to fight against the Haskalah. And specifically,
They
became allies, right? Again, united by the fact that they should have a shared belief in halacha, right? So this came in a meeting in Moscow, where the government had representatives of the Hasidim and the Misnagdim come to present their case against the Enlightenment. And the ones who came is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that's a Tzaddik, who's the grandson of the Alter Rebbe. And the left is Yitzchak ben Chaim. The Chaim here is Chaim Volozhiner, who's a student of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon. Now his son, Itchel Volozhiner, who ran the famous Volozhin Yeshiva, which is right here, they together went to Moscow for this meeting to push back against the Enlightenment. So just on this subject, are we clear so far?
So before the Reform movement, the Jews that they weren't from, what?
So the Enlightenment led to the Reform movement.
Okay, but before that, what
Just
was?
orthodoxy. There was only one form of
But
Judaism.
not everybody was from.
There were many people who weren't from, either because of ignorance or because they decided to leave. But in most of these times, in most of these places, there's no such thing as a secular person. You're either Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. Choose something. You can't be nothing. The idea of atheism didn't exist until the Enlightenment. Right? There's no such thing as just being a citizen of your country without attached to a religion. Because the government has to ask you, well, what do we assign to you? Which group are we putting you into, right?
They were from, or they were not women?
So there were Jews who, unfortunately, ended up in Christianity for whatever reason, either forced conversions or willfully converting, whatever. But just secular Jews warming around is an invention of the Enlightenment of the 16th, 17th, 1700s.
We are Jewish, but little different. Okay.
That only came with the Enlightenment at this period.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So Chassidim and the Misnagdim got together to push back against that. So here, on page 4, I'm going to read for you a really nice quote from the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who has a book called Kuntris Limud HaChassidus. It's a beautiful little booklet which describes how one should learn Chassidus, how one should approach Chassidus. And he describes this meeting between the Tzemach Tzedek and Itchel Volozhiner, this meeting of the leader of the Chassidim, Tzemach Tzedek, and the leader of the Misnagdim, Itchel Volozhiner, in Moscow fighting the Haskalah. And he writes like this, I'm reading the middle paragraph here. Hayoshish, the older man, Rabbi Yitzchak Rubashov of Petersburg, told me. He was there in Petersburg, and he served the Tzemach Tzedek, I guess he was an attendant. So there was a talk, I'm quoting now, there was talk amongst the members of the government that the meeting between the Tzemach Tzedek and the famous scholar of Itzel Volozhin was made known to the Misnagdim that the Chassidim are also Torah geniuses, Torah scholars, and to the Chassidim was made known that the Misnagdim are also pious, are also tzaddikim. So where they lived in two worlds, and the Misnagdim look at the Chassidim and say, oh, you guys are a populist movement, you don't have true Torah scholarship. And the Chassidim are looking at the Misnagdim and saying, you guys are big Torah scholars, but you don't really have good fear of heaven. In this meeting, they realized, no, these guys are also serving Hashem, and these guys are also Torah scholars. So that meeting and the fight to preserve halacha against the Enlightenment brought the Chassidim and Misnagdim together and basically ended all the major opposition. Even if they didn't embrace each other's lifestyles, but the opposition basically fell away between each other because they understood we're both here on the team of halacha, and we have to get together to fight team anti-halacha. Right? This is again this theme that halacha is what unites all the different streams of Judaism. Okay, so from there, now we link back to the halachic story we left off with last week. So last week we talked about the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch written by Rabbi of Cairo in the 1500s, and we described how the Ramah, and Moshe Israel in Poland, instead of writing a counter code, just added notes to Rabbi Yosef Cairo's code, so that you look at one code and you can see Sephardim do it this way, what Rabbi Yosef Cairo says, and the Ashkenazim do it this way, what Rabbi Moshe Israel says. And because it included both opinions, it became very popular. Basically, everybody used it. Everybody still uses it. And but from there, as we saw last week, there were the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch to add details, to introduce customs, to introduce maybe counter opinions that the Rabbi missed or that the Beis Yosef missed. So there's been more halacha written since the Shulchan Aruch until this point. So as it is with every couple of generations, there's always that scholar who comes along and says, okay, I'm going to codify and collect all the law that's been written since the last time it was a collection and a code. Right? So if Rambam did it the first time, and then the Torah did it the second time, and the Shulchan Aruch did it the third time, I'm skipping others in the middle, but these are the popular ones, now comes out there and says, I'm going to do it now. Actually, he was instructed by his teacher, the Maggid, to do that. So he collected all the halachic rulings from the Shulchan Aruch until his day, and put it into a code, what we call the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Now, what's unique about this code is that it's actually rather remarkable. And there's a English version here, which the white one. I'm not sure if it's completed yet, but a lot of it is. We have some of it in the library. If you don't have it, I recommend getting it. It's a relatively easy read. It's not a difficult read. And what he does that's unique to the Alter Rebbe's code is that he offers, as I write here, includes scriptural and Talmudic background and rationale for every halacha. As opposed to the code written by Rabbi Cairo, which is just do, don't do, point, following the method of Rambam, which is also just point, without any background or rationale as to how he got there. The Alter Rebbe includes background and rationale for everything. He'll start off by saying, the verse reads X, Y, and Z. Our sages understand this to mean X, Y, and Z. And therefore, opinion A understands it to mean this way, and therefore you would follow the halacha that way. And therefore others understand it this way, and therefore the halacha would be that way. Consideration 1, 2, 3, and 4, we're going to follow this way. Or he'll say, here in these countries, meaning in Ashkenaz, we do it this way, following that strain of view, but there's another view that goes the other way. Like this, he gives you a full rounded picture of everything that leads him to the conclusion he's coming to. So all the history we talked about over the last 4 classes, starting from the text of the Chumash, and then the oral tradition, and the Gemara, and then he puts it all into like one.
And all the previous codifiers?
He'll include all the previous codifiers in there. He won't name them. He'll say, some say, others say. There are those that say, and the footnotes will tell you who they are. Nice little footnotes written by Rabbi Levin. But it's all laid out there. So you can follow the line using the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. You can follow the line from Chumash down to the Halacha and where it's split and why it's split and what the different ways of thinking are and then why he's ruling a certain way. This is the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. He actually wrote the Shulchan Aruch twice. He wrote it once, and he later said in his life that he regretted that he relied too heavily on just collecting the halachic authorities from the generations before him and not enough relying on his own view and thinking. Specifically, he regretted relying on the Magen Avraham, which is one of the commentaries I mentioned last week. So he wrote the entire code again. Now, of that entire second version, we only have 4 chapters. All of it got burnt. There was a famous fire that destroyed a lot of the manuscripts, including that. So, by heaven, they decided we're only going to have the first version. With the exception of the first 4 chapters, the laws of Nevelasser. That's all we have from the second version of the Shulchan Aruch. So that's the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, which again, the Alter Rebbe passes away in 1812. So you're talking about the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s when this is being written. Now, following the same thinking of collecting all the halacha that was written from the last code till this code, the Mishnah Berurah, which is like the Litvish version of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, is written a little later by the famous Chafetz Chaim. His picture is there on the left. Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan, who lives in Nadin in Belarus. It's in Russia. It's very closely, not far. And it's a similar thing to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. In fact, it's written almost 100 years after the Shulchan Aruch, right? The Alter Rebbe lives in the late 1700s, passes away in 1812, and he's only born in 1838. So the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah is written almost 100 years after the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and sometimes he actually just paraphrases the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, but sometimes he'll have a little difference of opinion of how he rules based on whatever other considerations, and that's where the differences in halacha and custom that would emerge between the Chassidim and those who are not. Will emerge between the differences between the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah. And I say Chassidim now, by the way, I don't just mean Chabad Chassidim. I mean all Chassidim. All Chassidic groups will use the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, including Satmar Skver. They all use the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. That's their go-to.
So
as opposed to the Litvish, which would go from Mishnah Berurah.
Could you say that these two would be on the side of Ashkenaz?
They're so far all Ashkenaz. So far we're still in Ashkenaz. There were other codes written at this time. For example, there's Aruch HaShulchan, written at the same time as the Mishnah Berurah, in a few villages over, like not very far over, in Navardok. And for whatever reason, it didn't become as popular. I asked someone here, someone who knows a little bit, asked him why he thinks the Mishnah Berurah became popular and not the Aruch HaShulchan. And he suggested, and maybe he's right, that the Chafetz Chaim had a yeshiva, which means he had students and followers, so they would have popularized his book. Whereas the author of the Aruch HaShulchan, as popular as he was a rabbi in a town, didn't have a yeshiva to carry his word forward. Maybe. Anyway, by divine providence, the Mishnah Berurah became the de facto go-to for non-Hasidic Ashkenazic halachic ruling. And the Hasidic halachic ruling all follows Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. So, while this is all happening in Ashkenaz, we're clear so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So while this is all happening in Ashkenaz, very similar things are happening in Sfarad, in Sephardic countries, which is basically the Ottoman Empire. I have to be full transparency. My understanding of recent Sephardic history is not as good as my understanding of recent Ashkenazic history. That's why I said at the beginning. When you go farther back in history, so like Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is going to include in it Rambam Rif, but it isn't going to include recent Sephardic halachic codifiers. So I'm less familiar with them than I am with the Ashkenazic side, but nonetheless, the more famous names I'm going to share with you just because everybody knows who they are, and to give kind of a full, more rounded picture. So in the same way in the Ashkenazic countries, they have people who are coming along to collect and codify the customs, to update the Shulchan Aruch. Very same thing is happening in the Sephardic countries. And to your question about the issues, first of all, there's 2 ways to think about enlightenment as far as Sephardic countries go. And they're opposites, but they're kind of both true at the same time. First of all, the Enlightenment didn't really spread through the Ottoman Empire the same way it did in Europe. So they didn't deal with that opposition in the same way. Along with that comes the fact that even though they also had Shabtai Tzvi, actually Shabtai Tzvi was in the Ottoman Empire, for whatever reason he was much more popular in Poland. It was much scarier in Poland, and in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, than it was in Ashkenazi countries. So, for whatever reason, I'm sorry, the Sephardic countries. Sephardic countries here means the Ottoman Empire, right? We moved to North Africa.
Were the Spartans more successful financially at that time?
I don't know. I think so. I can't tell you for sure. I don't know. I think so. I don't know. For whatever reason, they didn't abandon Kabbalistic learning like the Ashkenazim did. The Ashkenazim were much more scared of it because of what happened with Shabbat Tzvi. The Sephardim were less, for whatever reason, they were less scared of it. So, for example, the Sephardim would have always been singing during davening. That wasn't something that they were afraid of. For example, we in Ashkenaz don't do Birchat Kohanim every day. Birchat Kohanim every day. We only do it on Yom Tov. In many Sephardic communities, they do Birchat Kohanim every day. Now the truth is, there's no reason why we don't. Like the halacha is, we should be doing it every day. Now the Ramah, again, back to the Shulchan Aruch, the Ashkenazi glosses to the Shulchan Aruch, he writes the reason why we don't do it every day is because Birchat Kohanim requires joy, and here in Ashkenaz it's just there's so much oppression that we can't do it every day. So he writes, so what do? The Alter Rebbe actually said that if I had the power, I would reinstate it. He never did, but he said, if I could, I would reinstate it. Wow. And I ought to say that I think the Sephardim didn't deal with the same issues during this time like the Ashkenazim did. So they never had this Sephardic Hasidic Misnagdic fight. They never dealt with the Enlightenment. Another thing I was going to add before, in terms of the Enlightenment, another possibility of thinking about it is that the Sephardim actually handled Enlightenment 300 years earlier. Because while Ashkenazim were separated from their big culture during like the Dark Ages in Western Europe, but in like the Rhineland, France, Germany, when they're going through Dark Ages, Spain under Muslim rule is going through it's what they call the Golden Era, right, where they're flourishing the culture. So the Sephardim already like dealt with the issues of like dealing with the modern secular world way before the Ashkenazim did. So that's also maybe a factor to why they didn't have the same issues that we had. So, for example, there's no such thing as Reform Sepharad. It doesn't exist. There's only one form of Judaism in Sephardic land. Orthodoxy. How much you want to practice, whatever, your choice. There's only one version of Judaism. It's Halacha, period. In Ashkenazi countries, we have like ultra-Orthodox down to our neighbors and everything in between, right? Because we negotiated with the Enlightenment fairly recently. So there are like earlier Sephardic times like during the
Arab countries, they were separated.
In actually, many ways, they were less separated than the Christians and they were more integrated actually. In Sephardic countries, they were more integrated.
You see the temples, the synagogues have to be down.
Yeah, so we were separate citizens, yeah, but they were more integrated than the.
But they were not mixed marriages like something like.
There was more integration in the Sephardic countries than there were in the Ashkenazi countries with their broader culture. Certainly, the farther back you go, there's
less persecuted, but
even more integration, like shared music and shared culture, whatever. Like the Rashba, we spoke about him a few classes ago, dealt with the whole issue of like how do we deal with the fact that all young kids are reading Aristotelian philosophy? How do we stop this? How do we deal with this? And he put like a ban. You can only read you can't read Aristotle until you're 20 or something like that. Until you have learned Gemara, then you could read Aristotle. That was never an issue in Ashkenazi countries because no one was reading Aristotle there, right? They didn't have the same until later, till the Enlightenment came around. Then it became a problem. Anyway, so here are three of the major halachic thinkers of Sephardic countries at this time. You may have heard of some of them, the Bircha Yosef, known as the Chidah. Yosef Chaim David Azulai, I believe is the grandfather of all the Azulais, I think, who lived in Yerushalayim, which is under the Ottoman Empire. The Ben Ish Chai, I'm sure many of you have heard of him. Many of Yosef Chaim lived in Baghdad, and the Kaf HaChaim, Yaakov Chaim Sefer Baghdad. It's actually the first and the third, the Bircha Yosef and the Kaf HaChaim, are both, their halachic writers are actually structured on the Shulchan Aruch. Like the same way the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is structured to follow the pattern of the Shulchan Aruch. These two are also that way. The Ben Ish Chai is a bit different, introducing a lot of Kabbalah actually. But these are some of the three major halachic writers and thinkers in Sephardic countries. Okay, we're clear so far? Yeah? Okay, so another thing that just generally what you find in like halachic responsa, right? There's always the responsa going on besides for the codification. And one of the major things that's discussed in responsa during this time period that really continues till this day is how to deal with industrialization and urbanization of communities and how halacha responds to that. Right? Till today, we're dealing with this, with modern medical advances, what's kosher, what's not kosher, medically speaking. With electricity on Shabbos, that was a big discussion when electricity came out. And when bikes were first invented, there's a whole discussion, halacha, can you drive a bike on Shabbos, not drive a bike on Shabbos? Shorter answer is no, you can't. But that's a whole discussion. And as these machines get invented, you have to start thinking about how halacha deals with it. So just two major examples that come up a lot in the halachic literature of this time is, first of all, mikvahs. Because when you're living in villages, you just go to the river. But when you're living in cities, you have to start collecting rainwater. It makes it much more complicated. How do you clean rainwater without ruining its purity as rainwater? So during the times when you have all these inventions of the water stacked on other water, you have, that's the Rabbi Shav mikvah, we have the rainwater on the bottom and the regular water on top. And you can see here the diagram where you have they put rainwater on the side. All kinds of different ingenious inventions are coming around to try to make mikvahs work in cities.
The mikvah that we found in the archaeology, they were not built?
They would have been built mikvahs, but a lot of them were just running rivers. Most of them would have been like a running river. Like, for example, you ever seen the Rizal's mikvah?
Yeah.
Okay, they dig a pit and then the river runs through it.
There is a
river, right? The river runs right through it.
There's a Mayan.
The spring, right?
Yeah.
The river from the spring just runs right through it. So you don't have to do anything to like make it kosher. It just is kosher because it's natural spring water.
So the one that we found now in the archaeology,
So
and everything.
Yeah, it's hard to know. Most of them would have used rivers and springs. But when you're in big cities,
in Yerushalayim for the Beis Hamikdash. So where?
Right. So that's where they have the Chizkiah's tunnel is to make the rivers run through. Right. It's all about getting natural water to like the springs to run through. So they would have used springs. No. You only have to do this when you have big cities and you can't just dig up a spring in your backyard in Montreal, right? So how do you build a mikvah here? Right. And then another one of the big discussions, which was a huge controversy, is machine matzah. This is apparently one of the early machine matzahs. Is machine matzah kosher for Pesach? Big discussion at the time. And the short of the halacha is that it is kosher for Pesach, but we don't use it for the night of the Seder to make the bracha. Even though it's technically kosher for Pesach because nothing is rising, but we don't use it for the mitzvah. And the reason is because the matzah you use for the mitzvah, the night of the Seder, has to be made with intentionality. The person has to make it with the intention that this is being made for the purpose of the mitzvah. And machines don't have intention. There is, to the best of my knowledge, there is still one community that actually specifically uses machine matzah, and they're of the view that the guy pressing the button has to have intention. But just a funny little thing, one of the big halachic leaders at the time, I can't remember who it was, who was against the machine matzahs, writes a whole response explaining why he thinks machine matzah is not okay, and then he concludes with, and what's going to happen to all those people who get employed by the matzah making industry? They're going to lose their jobs if machines come. This is a consideration that these halachic leaders are dealing with, not just the halachas, but also the realities and the changes that industrialization brings. So that also spills over into the halachic literature of the time. Okay, something we didn't talk about a lot, which is important to know as we go forward. Are we clear so far? Yeah. Is you may have heard of this like writing a siddur. There's this siddur, there's that siddur. What does it mean to write a siddur? You just make up your own prayer? Like how does that work? So everything we know from the last 4 classes, we'll understand it much better if you just follow this little pattern here on the left. So you can see I write that the first 3 are the mitzvah, Sinai to the Talmud, which is basically everything we read in the first 2 classes. Right? The pasuk says, this is what the verse says. This is a typical example of written law, oral law, and then rabbinic enactment. It's a typical example. The verse says, serve him with all your heart. Serve God with your heart. What does that mean? So comes the oral tradition and says, service of the heart is prayer. So if you stopped here, what do you do for prayer? Do whatever you want. Just pray. Right? Just do it yourself. Right? But then the sages came along and made a text outline. People are saying all kinds of things. They don't know how to properly communicate to God. Let's give them an outline so that they can follow. So we're not giving you the words yet. We're just giving you an outline. That outline is what today is what we call the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah. So they gave certain formulations like Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. That's a formulation that the sages put together saying, here's how you properly address God. Use these words. Right? And then they said, okay, here are themes you have to cover. Cover the themes of health, parnasa, themes of redemption, and they give a list of themes to cover in the structure of davening. And they said the first three should be praise of God, the last three thanks, and the middle is where you put your requests in. Right? So they gave an outline. But then from there, we have to go, okay, so if I want to make a siddur for people to use, I have to take this outline, which is scattered all over the Talmud. I got to go through the whole Talmud and find out where in the Talmud it talks about what the outline of prayer looks like, and then actually construct something that someone can use. So for many generations, the way davening would have worked is not everybody knew how to daven. First of all, no one has a siddur. There's no printing. Even if you had a manuscript, not necessarily didn't know how to read. So you showed up to the synagogue, the shul, and someone who was more learned, who knew the outline, would stand in the front, say out loud words that he chose using the outline described by the sages, and everybody else would just say Amen. And that was it. That became our repetition of the Amidah. That's what the repetition of the Amidah is. Right? So that's what it would have been. In fact, we have stories in the Gemara where one sage is listening to someone else lead the prayer and says, hey, you shouldn't be saying those words. That's not correct. Rephrase it that way. We have such stories in the Gemara, right? Because there's no formalized text yet, but they're still following the written tradition, the written text, which says, serve Hashem with your heart, and the oral tradition, which says that the way to do that is prayer, and the outline given by the sages. So as time goes on, communities are asking for, okay, give us a precise text so we can do this properly. We saw this a couple of weeks ago when, I think from Spain, they sent a letter to the Gaonim in Babylonia saying, give us a siddur. And that would have been the first two siddurim here, of Amram Gaon and of Saadia Gaon. Right? And then throughout the ages, Maser Vitris from Rashi, Rambam, Arizal, others, who have put together a siddur that would have given what they feel is the precise text to properly match the text outline given from the Gemara. So, which is why, broadly speaking, all siddurim will look the same in their structure and in certain formulations. Like there's no siddur which doesn't have Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam as the outline, because that's what the sages put in there. But the details of this word or that word, well, both of those follow the Gemara's ruling for the text, but it's a question of this linguistic expert thinks this is the right word, and that linguistic expert thinks that's the right word. Right? So this is a typical example of how everything we're learning at the last 4 classes gets played out in a book, in a siddur. Right? Now, other things that would be included in a siddur, besides for the precise text, which might change from one small variant from one siddur to another, is laws and customs. So a good siddur doesn't just have the words. It also says, stand here, sit here, right? And if it's a really good siddur, and it doesn't just cover your daily davening, it covers all reading material for a Jewish life cycle, which includes your Seder night, includes what blessings to make for your menorah, for Hanukkah, includes what to do for the Megillah, and includes everything, right? So it'll also have instructions there too. Hence different instructions for the Seder night. Pick up your matzah here, put your wine down here. Right? Different customs and halachas that will come out from a siddur. And likewise, if you get some siddurim will even include meditations and commentary, especially the more Kabbalistic ones. The Arizal siddurs, for example, will have that, of meditations and other things like that. Okay, so is that clear? So I hope you can see how everything we're learning plays out just in a siddur, right? Okay, so the Alter Rebbe compiled one such siddur. That's why I put this in here. But before we get to the Alter Rebbe siddur, let's look at this, page 9. I think this is
Rambam had it.
Yeah, so Rambam's siddur is part of his book of Halacha. Right, the Rambam wrote a code which covers every single area of Jewish life, including a siddur. It's stuck in there, yeah. I think the Yemenites use the Rambam siddur, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so on the next page here, keeping everything we learned in mind, we can answer the question, which is actually really what pushed me to do this whole series, because I get this question all the time. Like, how do Rabbi, someone mentioned the other day that people feel like halacha is hergish, just feeling. Yeah, how do you feel about it? And then that's how you decide halacha. And sometimes it feels like it's just loopholes and it's arbitrary. The rabbi just chooses one way or the other. But hopefully with everything we learned till now, we can appreciate that when a rabbi gets a question, he has to consider and ask himself, what the person's asking me, which one of these 5 categories, there's more, but 5 major categories are we going to put this question into? Is the person asking me a question that's of a biblical nature, in which case the answer is going to be black and white, either yes or no? Is it a rabbinic mitzvah? Like lighting Hanukkah candles is a rabbinic mitzvah. Now this is relevant because if you have a biblical mitzvah, that's in conflict now with the rabbinic mitzvah, which one are you going to do? You do the biblical one, right? So when he asks the question, he has to know, is it a biblical mitzvah? Is it a rabbinic mitzvah? Then moreover, this is the one that gets most confusing, is it a rabbinic enactment? So this is the common one, is the Eruv. Oh, it's a loophole. You can't carry on Shabbos, but you put a string around and all of a sudden you start carrying. That doesn't work. So if we understand how Shabbos evolved from the written text to the oral interpretation to the sages and so on, you understand why the Eruv works and why a rabbi might have discretion on to where and when an Eruv could be used. So to explain very briefly, the biblical mandate is you're not allowed to carry from a public domain to a private domain. That's the biblical prohibition, right? But what constitutes a biblical public domain and what constitutes a private domain? Right? So a private domain is an enclosed area. A public domain is a thoroughfare. So Cleve is not a public domain. It's not a thoroughfare. There's qualifications such as you have to have 600,000 people of traffic. We don't get 600,000 people on Cleve Road. Maybe Dekari is considered a public domain because one of the qualifications for a public domain is if it's a highway that takes you from one city to another. So maybe Dekari works because it's part of the 15, right, which would take you from one city to another, right? Which means, from the biblical connection perspective, I can carry on Cleve on Shabbos because I haven't walked into a public domain, right? So came King Solomon and said, this is way too confusing for people because people have a shared property which they think is public domain, and now they're carrying there and don't see that that's different than the actual marketplace, which is a real public domain. So he said, look, here's how we're going to make sure you don't get confused. Make an Eruv in your shared spaces. And that way you take your shared spaces and make it an actual private domain, and now you can carry inside there. So the Eruv is not a loophole, like we're getting away from the biblical narrative. It's the other way around. The biblical narrative is upheld even if you don't have an Eruv. The Eruv is there to prevent us from falling into accidentally carrying an actual public domain, right? And many, many other rabbinic enactments made like this. And this is often where you'll find the quote, bending of the rules. Because if the rabbinic enactment is meant to protect a certain halacha, then you have to know when to apply it, where to apply it, and when it can be overridden. Right? That's one of these questions. And muktzah is another example of that. The prohibition of muktzah is to touch something that you don't, or to move something, I should say, not touch, but to move something on Shabbos that you have no use for. That's the essence of the prohibition of muktzah. It went through a few different stages till muktzah became the way we know it today. So there's no biblical prohibition against that on Shabbos. The biblical prohibition is not to do any work. Moving my iPhone does not work on any level, but it's a boundary to keep me away from accidentally using my phone or accidentally carrying, whatever the reasons are for muktzah. So considering that, there are times when you can use it, because the whole thing was an enactment to keep you away to begin with. So as long as you're aware that you shouldn't be touching it, then say for certain types of muktzah, if I need the space, I can move it for certain kinds of muktzah, right? Just making the point that when the rabbis make a decision, these are the things he's considering. Is it a biblical question? Is it a rabbinic question? Is it a rabbinic enactment? Is it a gzera? Likewise, a serious Rav will know if the question you're asking is the kind of question that's been disputed for the last 300 years. And then I'll tell you, look, in Chabad, we rule with this group of people that have been fighting about this question for the last 300 years. But, if you follow the other halachic rulers, you're not going outside the bounds of halacha. So maybe, considering the circumstance, the rabbi might say, you should follow that version of halacha for whatever the considerations are. Right? So he's not finding loopholes and finding leeways to cut corners. He's understanding in which context to put your question and answering accordingly. Right? That's why a good rabbi will also not just ask you, not just tell you yes or no when you ask a question. He'll ask you the circumstances. Right? All right, is your family Sephardic? Is your family Ashkenazic? Is your Chabad family not a Chabad family? Because all these circumstances play into whether the gzera, the enactment should be imposed, whether we can rely on a certain opinion which disagrees with that opinion, right? And finally, whether what you're asking about is a minhag. Is it a custom? Right? So I put a kiddush cup here because that's a classic thing of a custom. How do you hold your kiddush cup? With a stem, without a stem. There are some communities that hold a kiddush cup like this, balanced on the 4 fingers. Others hold like this. Others hold it like this. Right? It's a question of custom, not a question of halacha at all. Right? So all of these things are important for anyone who's giving halachic rulings to take into consideration, and that explains why there's that what looks like wiggle room. Right? And why they're always asking me so many questions about the circumstances. so you can properly place it into these places and give you the proper answer. Okay, I hope that clarifies that a little bit. Okay, we're going to close out with two more things. One is the Chabad minhag, and then I want to close out with like a Hasidic perspective on the history we just did over the last 5 classes. So every community, I'm sure, can make a chart like this. Every community can probably draw a line from the halacha codifiers of their region and the people who collected customs in their region to all the customs that they follow till today. I'm just going to give you the Chabad kind of line. So you have the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch on the top left, the Alter Rebbe's code. That's of course going to be the overarching halachic go-to for anybody who's in Chabad. Chassidus in general, but Chabad for sure. And then, as I mentioned, the Alter Rebbe wrote a Siddur. The Siddur, as I said, doesn't just include a text of what you should say, but also includes practices. So it'll have details of how you should conduct your Seder. It'll have certain details about how to observe Shabbos and other things like that. And in many cases, the Siddur is much more stringent than the code. And the reason for that is because, again, the code was him collecting all the halachic rulings from the last couple hundred years since the Shulchan Aruch was collected 200 years before him. Right? So it was meant, the code was meant for just the masses of Jews who want to have access to the last 200 years of halacha. But the Siddur was written specifically for his followers, and therefore many cases where he's lenient in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Siddur will say, take the more stringent view. Or in the Siddur he'll say, in the Shulchan Aruch it says that you can follow this way, and that's true. But there's a Kabbalistic nuance you should add and hold your cup of Kiddush that way or something like that. He doesn't mention holding cup of Kiddush, but something of that nature, where he'll add little details of custom and stringency that are not in the Shulchan Aruch. So as a rule, we'll follow the code of Jewish law, the Alter Rebbe's code, but where the Siddur differs, we'll follow the Siddur. Right? Now included there is the Tzemach Tzedek, who I mentioned before, the Alter Rebbe's grandson, who wrote many responsa, and much of his responsa actually is, a lot of it is commentary on his grandfather's code, so anything that's in there will obviously include in Chabad custom and practice. Here in the middle, we have two Chassidim. The first is Rabbi Avram David Lavut, the chief rabbi of Nikolaev, also happens to be my great-great-great-great-grandfather. I'm not sure if I'm saying the right number of greats. My grandmother's great-grandfather. How many is that? Anyway, his son actually, he had a son that moved to Montreal. One of the first Chabad Chassidim in Montreal is his son. Anyway, he wrote a commentary to the Alter Rebbe Siddur, which includes nuanced and details of halacha and custom, and as well as a little while later, Avram Chaim Noah famously also wrote a commentary both to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and to the Alter Rebbe Siddur. So that would also be taken into consideration when we think of Chabad custom. And finally, you have the Rebbe's project. One of the first things the Rebbe did when he came to America is to begin to collect Chabad custom. It's found in Hayom Yom. Hayom Yom has a bunch of little customs. Those are things the Rebbe put in there. And it really came from the Rebbe's taking personal diary of what his father-in-law did, which is why I put this arrow here. Because from the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, down to the Rebbe, which is seventh Rebbe, there's Rebbe to Rebbe to Rebbe who have specific practices and customs that they're doing. And the Rebbe took meticulous notes of how his father-in-law would practice and made it his job to publicize it. So that people should know the exact right practice for Chabad. Very detailed, tiny nuances on how to do things. What to say, when to stand, when to sit, all these small little nuanced things. And the Rebbe commissioned Rabbi Levi Brunner and Rabbi Wolf Greenglass from Montreal to compile the official Sefer Menhagim, the official book of customs for Chabad. So between the book of Menhagim, the Siddur, and the Shulchan Aruch, you have Chabad practice there, right? The Rebbe didn't just collect Menhagim from his father-in-law, from the previous Rebbe, but also you can see a number of letters the Rebbe writes to Chassidim of an older generation asking them, did you observe how your father in your city would do X? Can you tell me about it? And he would collect information from older people about how things were done in Russia, in Chabad communities, and that would put together the proper, exact Chabad custom. And like I said, I'm sure every community can draw a map like this. I'm sure every single community can do that. Whether it's Square or Sephardic communities can all do the same thing, from their town, from their place, to get their specific custom. Clear so far? Okay, so finally, just a Hasidic way to think about this entire history. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, I'm sure you've heard this before, Hasidus teaches, based on the Medrash, that the purpose of creation is to make this world a home for God. Right? And the tools, the means by which we make that home, is Torah. That's why God gave us Torah. Gives us a Torah, gives us mitzvahs, says follow these instructions, and you build a home for Hashem. Now, when you're building a home, you go through many stages. So I divided it into 4, but you could probably break it down into more. You have the foundation, you have the actual structure, like the skeleton, then you have to put furniture in, and then you have the detailed interior design, right? And as time goes on, when you're building a home, you get more and more and more and more detailed. And the same thing happens in the history of halacha, as we learned over the last 5 classes, right? You start with the foundation. Is it in the written text and the oral text? And as long as you're following the written tradition and the oral form of interpretation, it's all that's the foundation. Everything else is built on top of that. And that's what the Mishnah is. The Mishnah and the Gemara is the structure of that interpretation, laying down the basic structure for interpreting Torah correctly. And then you get to more broad-based ideas, the furniture, let's be called from the Rishonim and the Achronim throughout the generations, and the contemporary law and custom, which as you can see is get very hyper-specific. That's like putting the small little details in Hashem's home, the little painting and the little small little things that turn it from, like my father says, it turns it from a house into a home. Right? It's the details that turn it into your specific home. So, although if you think about it from like the halach perspective, it's a custom. It's there's much more wiggle room there. But on the other hand, if we think about it in terms of making a home for Hashem, then these detailed customs are actually the most important. So if your community, your family, your whatever has a very specific way of doing something, keep it, preserve it. Even if it's not halachically mandated, but give it that extra emphasis, because that's the detail that takes the vast home that we're creating in our Torah observance and turns it into like very fine-tuned, specific home, exactly the way Hashem likes it, because I'm doing it very precisely the way I was taught from our teachers and Rebbes. Which is why I used the pictures here for custom, contemporary law and custom, 2 Torahs, right? The Sephardic Torah and the Ashkenazic Torah. So the details are just the beautification that goes on the outside. But when you open it up, it's the same exact Torah, with the same history, with the same storyline, and just as you evolve into building this grand home for Hashem, there's the details in that room, there's the details in that room, each of these represented by another of the Jewish communities. So I hope you enjoyed that. Be'ezer Hashem, after the secular New Year, after January, we're going to do another series like this, 5 parts, and we're going to be looking at women in Torah scholarship, which should be interesting. We'll go through some biographies and some thoughts about how the role of women's learning have changed and evolved over time. That's coming, God willing, after the break. So if you enjoyed it, thank you all for joining this series.
Thank you so much.